Hi, I'm Nadav Shemer for Mining Journal's Digging for Climate Change, and we're here for a panel discussion on the subject of can miners achieve net zero while satisfying the growing material demands of the global economy? We have a fantastic lineup consisting of Aimee Boulanger, Executive Director of the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA. They're a provider of third-party certification of mine sites for responsible mining, and the IRMA standard contains 4 key principles: business integrity, planning for positive legacies, social responsibility, and the one that concerns our topic today, environmental responsibility. That includes greenhouse gas emissions, of course. We have Kirsten, Hund, Head of Carbon Neutrality at De Beers Group, the leading diamond producer and retailer, and it's fair to say one of the most recognizable names in mining in the broader community. Veronica Martinez, Senior Manager, Innovation and Climate Change for the International Council on Mining and Metals, ICMM, which represents 26 of the world's largest mining companies, and they account for roughly 1/3 of the mining sector by market value. And Andrew van Zyl, Principal Consultant and Director at SRK Consulting, an international consultancy working with major, mid-sized and junior mining and exploration companies on everything from due diligence and technical studies to permitting and closure. And SRK have been a partner of our Digging for Climate Change initiative from since we launched the site. So let's begin with the first part of the subject. Can miners achieve net zero? In late 2021, the members of the ICMM announced a joint commitment to achieve net zero scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or sooner, and various non-members have jumped on board with similar commitments. Just for those who aren't familiar, scope 1 and 2 are the emissions from direct operations under a company's control, that's 1, and from energy generated for use in operations, scope 2. And according to McKinsey, the mining sector scope 1 and 2 emissions account for 1% of all global GHG emissions. That's excluding a separate category of fugitive methane emissions from coal mining, which brings it up to 4 to 7%. And then scope 3, which is a separate issue that we'll discuss in another panel as well, refers to emissions up and down the company's value chain. And if we include these, the mining sector's share of global emissions blows out to 28%, according to that McKinsey study. So Veronica, I understand it's early days, but are you able to provide a progress report on the work that ICMM members are doing towards achieving their net zero goals? And is that 2050 timeline achievable?
Sure. Thanks, Nadav. Thanks for inviting me to this webinar. Just as Nadav mentioned, so last year, ICMM members made these collective commitments to achieve net zero scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050. And 2050 or sooner. And we see these very as a pivotal moment in our history, because by speaking with one voice as ICMM that represent about, as you said, 1/3 of the global market, including more than 650 sites over 50 countries, we really think we can drive emission reduction at scale. And I think that's the important bit in this discussion, whether we can achieve emission reduction at scale. Our commitment includes not only this long-term goal, but also setting the short and or medium-term targets. All of our member companies need to set that. And we see this a critical point within our commitment, because it's, I think it's the foundation to really setting clear and credible decarbonization pathways. This is not only about the endpoint, but this is really how you're going to achieve that endpoint. And we have seen great progress since we launched, in terms just of target setting, since we launched our position statement. So before launching our position statement, about 14 of our members had somehow net zero aspiration, goal, ambition, the name changes a bit. But now, of course, all 26 have it. And in the medium and short-term action, we before the position statement, we had about 15 members that had different type of intermediate targets, and now we have over 20. So in just 1 year, we're seeing great progress just in the aspect of target setting. But also, we have made great progress in just in reducing emissions and accelerating, the technology development and adoption for those critical hotspots around scope 1 and 2 emissions. And I think the greatest example is the Innovation for Clean and Safer Vehicles initiative that we have. It's a collaborative initiative that we have with the original truck manufacturers, because from scope 1 emission, which is, around 40% of the total from scope 1 and 2 in average, around 50% are represented by mining trucks. You know, these 300-ton truck that consumes 4,000 liters per day. So you can imagine how much diesel it consumes. And we have made a partnership with them, a collaboration to accelerate the development. And just for you to know how fast and how quickly these things have developed. We initiated this initiative in 2018, and the target, that the ambition that we have, was to make the technology available to have zero-emission haul trucks by 2040 at scale. And now, 3 years later, and by that time, that ambition was, okay, this is ambitious enough, how we're going to achieve it, etc. And now, 3 years after, we have, you know, original equipment manufacturers like Komatsu, Caterpillar, announcing that the technology will become available before the end of this decade. So that's a significant progress and clear how, you know, the technology will be available. And as ICMM, we're encouraging our members to really think how the adoption can happen faster, can happen at scale. We have this concept about adoption readiness. So to be ready for when that technology comes available so you can deploy it at scale. So that's, you know, we're seeing big changes there. And also scope 2 emissions, a lot of, you know, significant progress made in specific jurisdictions. So for example, my home country, Chile, you know, one key mining jurisdiction, we expect around by 2025, so it's only in 3 years, around 90% of the mines there will have renewable energy as part of their supply. And a lot of the mines like Escondida and others are, you know, right now, currently 100% renewable power. So of course, this will depend a little bit more on the jurisdiction, but we're seeing a lot of great progress there. And finally, Nadav, you mentioned scope 3 emissions that are a bit outside, but for us also was a key and a very, very important part of our commitment. And we all this year, you know, the first half of the year, we have been working in developing, really understanding, because setting scope 3 targets is part of the commitment, but we want to set our members to set meaningful targets. And for that, I think one critical first step is to really measure and report correctly scope 3 emissions, really understand where those hotspots in your value chain are. So we have been working for the past, you know, since January on developing some guidance for our members across all 15 categories of scope 3 emissions, just as an initial step to credible target setting and then enabling meaningful action with different actors at the value chain. So a lot has happened in this last year, but we hopefully will see more happen in the next month.
And Kirsten, to you next, your parent company, Anglo American, was obviously part of the ICMM commitment as one of the major mining companies. Can you tell us briefly about De Beers' own net zero strategy and how the company is progressing towards those goals?
Yes, of course. Thank you. And yeah, thanks for having me here and to be part of this discussion. Yes, so De Beers is part of Anglo, obviously. At the same time, because we are a consumer-facing product, we receive a little more pressure than some of the other mining companies about our carbon footprint. So we have, in November 2020, made a commitment to be carbon neutral for Scope 1 and 2 by 2030. So we're working very hard towards that. And at the same time, we've said, listen, yes, we're going to focus on Scope 1 and 2. At the same time, we're going to use 2021 to really do our Scope 3 baseline and define a strategy for that as well. So at the moment, our strategy is really around 3 pillars: reduce, replace, remove / recover, whereby reduce is really around efficiency. I mean, it's in a way the low-hanging fruit, right? How can we mine and do our operations in such a way that we use less energy and apply all kind of technological and innovative methods to do so. Replace, and that's where, well, the largest part of my time goes into, is replacing fossil-based energy and fuel. I mean, most of our operations are in Southern Africa, so our emissions, well, our energy comes from the grid, which is coal-based. So that is a big part of our emissions. So we are doing a lot of work in partnership with Anglo American on developing on-site renewable energy. We're busy developing 45 megawatt of solar and 35 in South Africa and around 35 megawatt of wind in Namibia. And we're exploring a lot of different additional options. There's lots of feasibility studies going on at the moment to look at what else we can do to really get to 100% renewables. At the same time, we're looking at diesel replacement. I think that is a piece of the puzzle that nobody has fully resolved yet at this point in time. Part of it is electrification. We're very much working on that. We are working on hydrogen trucks. Again, Anglo American did launch their first green hydrogen truck at their Mogalakwena mine a couple of months ago. And we're looking to see if we can roll that out at some of our diamond operations as well. But we need to do more than that, and you can't have every piece of equipment run on green hydrogen either. So I think we're doing a lot of research and looking at different options to really resolve that piece. And then the last one, and really for the last hard to abate emissions that we really cannot get rid of by 2030, we're talking about offsets. But there as well, we're very much looking at developing our own. So not just buying them off the market somewhere else, but really looking at, okay, how can we define and develop nature-based carbon solutions that are in line with our broader sustainability building forever framework, that are, if at all possible, in the countries and the communities where we operate, so that we're not only sequestering carbon, but also creating jobs, enhancing biodiversity, helping with water, helping with climate adaptation, if you want. So really trying to make that part of a comprehensive framework. So that's what we're trying to do on scope 1 and 2. Scope 3, as I said, we did the baseline. We have identified it's around 60% of our total emissions. And we're working very hard on rolling out a strategy on that right now. And we have said we are going to set science-based targets in due course of this year, which will include scope 1, 2, and 3. So working towards net zero, not fully by 2030, but in time to be aligned with the science-based targets. That was a mouthful, but that's where we are at this point.
And Andrew, SRK sits in a really unique position because you're a consultant to mining companies, as I understand it, of all sizes, from major through to exploration, development stage companies. So what have you observed sort of across those different tiers of mining companies in terms of net zero goals and action so far?
So we're obviously seeing quite a bit of interest from a number of our clients. What we're also seeing is we've had some government or government associated entities approach us and try and get a handle on how the mining industry is progressing. A number of nations have also made commitments, and they're trying to get a feel for are their commitments achievable. Remember, anything that they bring in that doesn't meet their net zero goal, they have to find a way of creating negative emissions somewhere else. So I think that there's, that's just an example of how the sort of pressure will build on the industry to find solutions. At the same time, I think the industry has been very proactive in looking for solutions. I think it's done really well to sort of get started. But it's a long and challenging road, and there's so many smaller bits of the puzzle to also solve. I think we're only starting now to see which regulatory agencies, for example, which ministries' toes we're stepping on. So I think we've built up quite a bit of expertise dealing with departments of mineral resources or sort of mining ministries as such. We're now getting into spaces where we may well start to interfere with ministries of transport, ministries of energy. So we're having to expand sort of where we have influence or where we need influence. We're going to start to need new technical skills. They'll need to be trained somewhere. So there's quite a few smaller issues that are actually quite important and can sort of interfere with the rollout of the technologies that are also still in development. So sorry, I tend to also, just as a background, I tend to default to a bit of a due diligence hat and can I declare a reserve here? And a lot of that requires proved technologies. And so I need to feel comfortable that, not only can the truck, function as it's designed, but it must be something that you can comfortably order from a manufacturer and reasonably expect delivery on the date that you need it. It must be something with sort of proved capital and operating costs, with a proved sort of availability cycle, that you can prove you have a technician who can service it. So that's a lot of where I'm thinking, and I think we've made some great progress, but there are a lot of real practical challenges that we're still facing to put all the pieces together. And and as I say, I think some of the really key ones are really impacting, or really where we engage with government agencies to allow us to do the things that we need to do. And I think, Kirsten will probably also agree that, on the renewable power, it's been technically achievable for a while, but in many jurisdictions, you just haven't been allowed to use it. So those are things where we're making some breakthroughs, and it's really a concerted effort on the part of the industry to not only facilitate the technological innovation, but also to innovate around regulatory environments and other things to make it possible, legal, if you like, to actually intervene in the ways that we need to.
And Aimee, one of the chapters in the IRMA standard talks about greenhouse gas emissions. When we spoke earlier before this panel, you mentioned that your organization is working on strengthening that chapter. I think you said it was published in 2018 and it's become a little outdated. A lot's changed since then in 4 years. Are you able to share any preview into who you're working with to update the chapter, what it will look like, or how you'll strike a balance, I guess, between what you'd like to see achieved in an ideal world and what is realistically achievable?
Well, that's right, Nadav. And I'll actually go backwards before I cast the view forward. I mean, first is to say that, IRMA is the most comprehensive and rigorous definition of what would be responsible mining agreed across diverse stakeholders in the world right now. And I put that context there because the greenhouse gas chapter no longer reflects that reality. It doesn't reflect right now what is considered best practice at the fore. It took IRMA from 2006 to that 2018 release of the standard, going through multiple drafts, multiple global public comments, field tests in Southern Africa and in North America. And so when the current live standard was released in 2018, the chapter on greenhouse gas emissions, which is just one of 26 chapters, was what could be agreed to across diverse stakeholders. And to be clear, at that time, there were purchasers and civil society already asking for science-based targets, but it was still new enough that you saw the industry struggling with how do you implement this on the ground. And since so much of the emissions reporting at that time also was company-wide, and IRMA measures achievement site by site by site, really thinking about how is that going to be done at the site. So that chapter at the time was viewed as forward thinking and solution-oriented across diverse stakeholders. But I love going last in this conversation here because Veronica and Kirsten and Andrew have already shared a whole host of ways that the world has moved on in those 4 years. And so it's really exciting. We knew that chapter would be one that we'd have to dig back into, but that process right now has not been at all controversial across stakeholder sectors because there's so much agreement on this is work that must be done. As Veronica said already, there's work that's already outpacing aspirations. There's some technology that's already ahead of the curve because there's been seen a market advantage to let's get going on this. Andrew's comments on governments working with companies in a shared effort to meet commitments in both worlds. And then Kirsten's points also on the idea of more than just net, more than just offsets. The idea that point that Kirsten made there, I think, is so important about what's happening in each site, because of course, net and offsets don't really deal with what's the impact in a given community and in a given region and ecosystem from the emissions that come out from these. And so really looking at how can we do good in each site, in each region. So I think those are the sorts of things you're going to see in this new draft chapter. It's being worked on throughout this year and it'll be across stakeholders. So I'm not going to say this is what it is because I won't decide that. It'll be a diverse world of stakeholders, but all of these views are part of that. And we've seen the Mining Association of Canada adopt more rigorous expectations and their own expectations for their members. So I really see the world moving this way with agreement. And so I think it'll be this host of other issues that also go along with emissions reductions as well. And I look forward to talking about those also.
So that brings us to the second part of the main question, the theme of this panel, which is meeting the growing demands of the global economy. There's sort of a natural conflict there as well. It gets said a lot, but it's worth repeating. Without the raw materials produced by miners, there's a lot we can't do in the world. building and maintaining infrastructure, maintaining manufacturing important products, consumer household products, even feeding the world. And certainly without critical raw materials, the list is endless, but just to name a few: copper, nickel, lithium, graphite, even iron ore, we have no way of producing the things we need for a green energy transition, electric vehicles, wind turbines, battery storage, the list goes on. With this in mind, how can miners reduce and eliminate emissions in what is naturally an energy intensive industry, while at the same time responding to their critical mission now, their number one mission for the coming decades, which is to produce more raw materials for the global economy? Or to break this down into two questions, if you're a mining company, what should be your priorities? Like what should be the top of your net zero strategy? And how much of a barrier will more production be to achieving these net zero commitments? Aimee, let's start with you for this question.
Well, I'm going to let Kirsten and Veronica and Andrew speak some to the specifics on your technology there, and I'm actually going to distract your question a little bit by, as I warned you I would, on this, in that I think it's essential, first of all. I mean, there's a narrative to your question that says we need more of these materials that go into to then support renewable energy sources with less carbon impacts from them. But if we cause greater problems and exacerbate, whether that through emissions or other impacts in an already climate stressed world, we're creating a set of problems that may be greater harm than our solutions. And we know we can't let that happen. We've lived these last 4 years with a set of places of progress that Veronica spoke to, in part because a world under health stress in the pandemic and under climate stress doesn't allow us, a sitting back moment. And for places where actually mining is happening, we can't separate the production of these materials from harm to increasingly fragile freshwater sources. What's not relied on today for drinking water may well be relied on for drinking water in only 5-10 years, not just 50 or centuries ahead. We have seen tragic issues of mine waste, disasters, particularly as our 500-year floods now seem to come every few years instead, and we've got things that we didn't design for 4 decades ago that we now have to rely on for human rights safety of the communities downstream of mine waste. So we're not going to be able to separate net zero commitments away from the other issues of responsible practices. And if we do, it's to our peril on multiple different levels, on the well-being of our communities, but also on communities who are going to increasingly push back against extraction and say, sorry, but we in the Atacama, we in Nevada, we in Southern Africa don't see this iron ore, this lithium production as being to our benefit. We're not driving these fancy new electric cars. So some of the solutions that are being talked about that share power with local communities, that are pairing response to mine waste and protecting water resources and reducing conflict in communities and showing that respect for Indigenous communities who also feel at the edge, are all part and parcel of this. And so the solutions, I'm sure my other 3 panelists will share, we count on them being integrated and not separated out as let's just look at emissions. So I'll let others respond to that piece.
Andrew, how would you view this question?
I mean, it's a complicated question. I would say that I suppose one of the first things to remember is that the mining industry in and of itself doesn't really decide what production should be. We're very much a demand taker, outside of maybe De Beers, which is an exception maybe in the industry. But for most of the industry, we are dependent on. So as an industry, we're not really the kind of industry that says, well, we think electric cars are going to dominate, and therefore we think X amount of lithium will be required in year 10. Therefore, we'll build X number of mines, which take 8 years to get started, and then we'll be able to supply the demand. We're very much we're reliant on spot and forecast prices to finance projects in the short term. Some of the bigger companies, even there where they're in a position to self-finance, you still very much, you tend to wait until the market's already there before you climb in. So it's quite difficult to meet demand challenges that you think will come about. That's not really how the industry has been designed. So we are slow to respond. We're less able to respond because of, you know, the fact that we have some severe physical constraints. It just takes a certain amount of time to identify and delineate an ore body. It takes a certain amount of time to engage responsibly with stakeholders, to develop your social license, to understand your baseline environmental and social conditions before you build a mine and impact those conditions and can't measure them anymore. So in order to be responsible, we have a very long process to start mining, and we're often not really able to. There aren't many places in that sort of timeline that we can fast track anything without being irresponsible. So it is a little bit it's a little bit chicken and egg on how we meet the demand. At the same time, we're also in a position where we have long lead time. So you have a number of years where you study something prior to construction, for example. I can't really build into a study technology that I think will be in place when we start construction. I can only work with existing technology, and it must be proved technology. Otherwise, I can't produce a feasibility study that complies with the regulatory requirements, for example. So to that extent, we're always running a little bit behind technology when we do studies. I can't use a hydrogen truck that will be proved in 3 to 5 years' time, but isn't now. I have to include existing technology that I can say, well, this is how much a truck costs to purchase, this is how much it costs to operate, this is the availability annually. And I've got qualified technicians who can service it, who earn salaries of X amount. So I'm restricted in what I can put into a study now to existing technology. But the studies I'm doing now will be operations in 3 years' time. They will place orders on equipment that will be delivered then, that you'll then use for 10 years. So all of those are just practical constraints around, you know, how we. So yes, I think as an industry, we're doing some great innovative work. We're you know, we've as Veronica was saying earlier, in many respects, we're bringing the timeline forward. But we're also not a flexible, adaptable industry. We've built an industry. We've worked really hard to build a responsible industry, to approach particularly environmental and social obligations very seriously, and those just, you know, create timelines that are you know, that are difficult to shorten, and it's difficult to then you know, suddenly change direction, whether it comes to supplying a specific commodity or using the technology on site to provide that commodity.
And Veronica, given your work with many of the world's biggest mining companies, your thoughts on this natural conflict between net zero goals and then meeting the demands of the global economy?
Yeah, sure. It was a very interesting point. I made a note here on what Andrew was mentioning about how do we challenge, you know, this paradigm of developing the mine of the future with the technology of the past. And that's why I was mentioning that, you know, the mine readiness or the adoption readiness concept that allows you to try to anticipate as much as possible that. But I think, first of all, I would like to mention that we as ICMM, we're really focused on ensuring that we meet that rising demand with sustainable produced metals, right? And that's what we encourage all of our members to do. But there are really, you know, this big question of how do we minimize damage and maximize the benefit of mining, and how do we ensure the metals that are treated correctly once they get into the market, right? So because we have to be realistic that probably not all the demand will need to be met with raw minerals, but really bringing that concept of circularity. So for example, this year and for this new strategy cycle as ICMM, circular economy is a project for the first time at ICMM, and we're trying to put the circular, you know, narrative within our members and really, you know, bring the sector into the circular economy discussion. So we need to think about how the metals that we're extracting, how they enter the market, and how we can recover them after they have been used, and how we can put it again into the market. So because I don't think it's reasonable to think that we can just extract raw minerals to meet that rise in demand. I don't know if you read, the last week this report around copper. It just shows that there's no, and there's this example that probably to meet that rise in demand in copper, you would need to build an escondida every 2 years or something like that. That we know that that's not possible, right? So I think bringing those concepts of circular economy, how can we make the metals last longer in the market, last longer in the products, etc. And that requires a lot of downstream engagement, at least from the mining sector, as in the upper part of the value chain, how we engage with downstream. But then when it comes to net zero and then those net zero strategies, I think what we've tried to encourage our member companies through our net zero commitment was basically ambition. So be bold, be ambitious, Paris aligned, but really not really focus on the long term, but really what you're going to do in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, because we need significant reductions now, because the time frame is getting shorter. And also you have to be credible and transparent. And I think that this is one key issue about disclosing your emissions. That's why we're working really hard on Scope 3 emissions. But also, and I think someone from the panel also mentioned, mining is also quite affected by the physical risks of climate change, and not only mine sites, but also host communities. So really think about those adaptation plans, and also think about the transition in the business way, but also how you make your operations more resilient to climate change. And really seek for that collaboration. I think the challenge is so big that will be impossible to tackle by one company, one sector by itself. So we really need that cross-sectoral collaboration and upstream and downstream the value chain, and that takes time, right? Collaborating between sectors, even within companies from the same sector, sometimes takes time. So we need to, and we don't have that much time, to be honest. So that's why we're trying to, in organizations like ICMM and others, really to accelerate that type of collaboration and driving that emission reduction at scale.
And Kirsten, diamonds, as has been mentioned, they're obviously not a necessity in the same way as critical raw materials, but in many ways they are a benchmark of how well we're doing as a society. A mark of prosperity as societies become wealthier, demand grows. You see this with developing economies emerging into becoming developed economies as well, which is obviously a good thing. So I'd imagine that De Beers, having around 30% market share, would be confident that demand for diamonds, and particularly natural diamonds, will continue to grow well into the future. So how are you reconciling this question? The possibility, that the hope, I guess, of needing to meet further demand with your ambitious net zero goals?
It is an interesting question, and honestly, for this question, it's my previous head as a World Bank person and my current De Beers person are sort of warring with each other, wanting to say a whole lot of different things. But firstly, yes, diamonds are not a necessity, right? They're a discretionary luxury product. And for that reason, carbon reduction targets are even more critical for the diamond industry, as well, consumers will vote with their wallets if the industry can't demonstrate how it is living up to what we see as increasingly ambitious, well, how do you say that, strenuous consumer expectations with regards to climate change, and not just climate change, other social issues as well, right? If people buy something like a diamond, they want to know that it has contributed something good and something useful. And we see people becoming much more educated about the impact of their purchase on people, on the planet. And in the luxury space, we see that values become much more important. It is interesting. It's sometimes also frustrating, because we were talking about, well, a conflict between addressing rising demand and net zero, but I also sometimes see a conflict between achieving net zero and sustainable development. And I think that's very much linked to what Aimee just said, because I see often we have discussions with luxury brands who are very, very insistent on us reducing our carbon footprint because we are such a big chunk of their Scope 3 emissions. And when we then try to explain to them, like, listen, this is a process. All the renewable energy that you maybe can buy off the shelf in Europe, we need to develop it first. We need to build it. We need to change regulations. We need to work with communities. This is going to take time. I can't commit to be fully only relying on renewable energy by 2024, right? It's going to take me a few years to get there. And it's a whole process which will educate people, create jobs, etc. on the way as well. And in the meantime, I cannot show a significant reduction of my carbon emission numbers. There's a lot of other things I can show, but not that. And I think that insistence on carbon data only as almost, how do you say that, a tunnel vision, and I see the same in Europe, right? There's so much pressure on, okay, let's produce in Europe, let's produce locally so we know it's produced sustainably. But thereby you're excluding such a big part of the world where the transition is even more needed, and sustainable development and that kind of support is even more needed. And that I find sometimes frustrating, and it's like, how do we work together to actually tell that story effectively? How do we tell that, yes, we want to be net zero, but it's going to take time, and it is a transformation, and we need to take a lot of other people along, and it's going to change a lot, and we all know it is very much needed. I mean, as you can see, I mean, we're sitting in the middle of a heat wave here in Northern Europe, right? That is waking up people to the urgency of getting this done. But I sometimes feel that the consumer pressure and the political pressure from one side isn't always helpful in that sense. Sorry, that was a complex answer to your question, but I think it is very relevant and something that we need to think about together. How do we create a comprehensive narrative around net zero?
And the final question I wanted to ask, and kind of relates to that last point, is how stakeholders, of which there are many, investors and users, government, society at large, how they should be judging different companies on the issue of net zero we've talked about. So obviously it's one thing to expect a major miner in the right conditions, perhaps someone with abundant solar or wind, to invest in things like on-site renewables, EVs. A smaller or mid-sized company that's developing a project, perhaps with a shorter mine life, might argue that they can't do such things. So how much emphasis, what can be reasonably expected of those companies, and how much emphasis should be put on, say, instead of making progress on those issues, on how, say, what they're contributing to emission through, say, production of critical raw materials, or through things like carbon offsets, I know they've been mentioned today, or avoided emissions. How much should these things be factored in when assessing companies? How much should we recognize the complexities of case-by-case basis? So Andrew, again, as somebody who's in a unique position of working with mining companies across all sizes, from majors to explorers, how would you view this issue?
Oh, jeez. I mean, it's. I see Aimee chuckling there. I mean, we just look at something like responsible sourcing. It can take you years to decide what that even means. So I guess this is part of, Kirsten also mentioned about engaging with governments. I mentioned it. We have to engage with our stakeholders and explain to them this journey that we're on. It's a long, fraught journey. There's a lot of things that we're going to have to sort of find a way to get done, find a way to do, and messaging is important. If we're going to, we've made mistakes in the past where we've sort of issued, overly rosy messages to stakeholders to try and drive short-term share price changes, and I think if we fall into that trap, we're going to struggle to explain to people why this is a long and complex journey. I think it's really important to celebrate the successes that we've had. I think it's important to note that the industry is doing well, but as was pointed out, it is also important to note that it does take years, to take a community with you on a journey. To take our stakeholders with us on what we need to do and why it's taking time, to do it responsibly, and to do it. I mean, a comment came up as well around just, in many ways, the more urgent challenge in many settings is really around climate resilience. We have places that are experiencing floods, experiencing droughts, experiencing extreme weather events. and in between those things, which are immediate crises that threaten your production immediately, we're also trying to run this long-term program of adapting our operations to be part of a sort of broader mitigation effort, a broader sort of collaboration towards carbon neutrality and reducing the how extreme these events are, etc. So messaging is important, communication is important. I think the sense of urgency is there. I think companies are there's enough discussion around decarbonization, almost to the extent that I think we're almost at risk of forgetting about water and other very immediate threats. But we've just got to we've got to do the long hard work of taking regulatory agencies, of engaging with governments, engaging with different departments, of training, of upskilling, of stakeholder engagement, taking communities with us. And it's not a glamorous process, but I think we've learned so much. I mean, we could carry on about social transition to closure that the ICMM came out with recently. Those are all things where every year we've learned a little bit more. We've gone from carbon emissions and planting trees to understanding that biodiversity is important. So this is all part of the learning process that we're on, and we need to keep learning. We need to keep understanding what best practice is each year. We need to adapt regulations, and we need to take people with us, and we need to take them with us honestly and with a lot of effort.
Aimee, you're also in a great position to observe this. Andrew mentioned just now responsible mining, and we've discussed it. And your standard obviously has been adopted by everyone from major miners, Anglo-American, I think, and a few of the world's major lithium producers are on there. Albemarle from memory, and a couple of other big ones. Several explorers, end users, and then groups representing other stakeholders, communities. And so forth. So how would you view this complex situation?
Well, I want to echo what a few have said about the importance of not trading these issues off of one another. I mean, in some ways, it reminds me of this moment a few years back where all the attention was on child labor and forced labor, incredibly important issues, right? Where a zero tolerance policy makes sense. But if all we were talking about was child labor, in an industry where the large-scale mines have very little of that as the actual risk, you had far more harm at risk for children living near mine sites with water issues at that time than often with child labor. And again, that didn't mean don't work on child labor and forced labor, incredibly important issues. But if we're trading off and just focusing on one issue, to Andrew's point, we're missing some of these others, which may have even graver impacts in this climate stress world. So if a company's not focusing on its emissions issues because they just don't want to focus on those, obviously that's a harm. But to Kirsten's point on looking at this whole picture, and Nadav, to what you said about due diligence, increasingly these end purchasers are being asked and even legally mandated to do their due diligence to understand the harm in their supply chain and to be active in working to reduce that harm. It's essential that we bring these issues together and we talk about how emissions fit with these protection of water resources, biodiversity, indigenous communities in conflict, and how are we reducing that conflict. And then Veronica's excellent important points about circular economy is that, how are we looking at reducing some of these impacts that come from new extraction. And even as we do that, we're still going to run into the emissions issue, right? Because recycling is its own mineral processing form and it's greenhouse gas emission intensive. It has its own issues and its own responsible sourcing issues that go with that. And so even though we always want to simplify things as we try to get to them promptly, it's complicated. And you can make complicated solutions to complicated problems beautiful, but thinking you're just going to make them simple is usually not the reality. So it's great to hear the ideas shared on this call.
Kirsten, how do you view these how do you view balancing these different important issues? We discussed in a recent interview that was posted to Dig In for Climate Change. For those that haven't seen it, how to be as a consumer-facing miner has these unique perspective in terms of the stakeholders, from consumers all the way through to the communities, back to the communities that you work with, mainly in Southern Africa, where you produce? How do you balance these competing issues?
Well, it's a crucial part of the work, and I mean, for us, it's consumers and downstream, but it's also, I mean, the De Beers mines in Namibia and Botswana are majority government owned, right? So the governments in these countries are also incredibly important stakeholders for us as well. So we do, and for them, reducing their carbon footprint is sometimes maybe less important than energy independence, for example, right? So how do you balance out those different interests? And how do you really engage with these governments and bring them along on the journey, work with them on a regulatory framework that allows you what needs to be done, but also just make sure that they see, and that also that we put measures in place that make sure that the local population benefits from whatever we do, right? That we don't just bring in foreign workers to build solar panels, so that we look at, okay, what kind of capacity building programs can we develop with them to make sure that green economic development becomes a driver for change. It's something what we're looking at in Namibia, for example. And then I said it before, I think it's a lot about telling your story, right? And sharing your story with all the different stakeholders, explaining why you're doing what you're doing, what the reasons are, making sure it's embedded, make sure that if we develop renewable energy, we do that in an area that doesn't harm biodiversity, for example. I think there's a lot of that as well. I think nothing in this whole sustainability space is standalone, right? We do know people care. We've done extensive consumer research, and I think right now for diamonds, like sustainability questions are on par with price for consumers. So it is like there's a direct business imperative to do this and to make sure, but it also just, if we don't connect, if we don't build those good stakeholder relations, we cannot operate and we cannot do what we do. So I think it is important on so many levels, and where it comes to developing offsets, it becomes even more crucial, right? Because it has such a bad reputation. If we say, we're planting trees in California to offset our emissions in Southern Africa, how is that a credible story, right? Which is why and I think you referred to it, we have, but that's just one tiny example, invested in a startup that's planting giant kelp just off the coast of Namibia. We're not sure it's going to get us carbon credits. We hope so. I mean, it's one of the reasons we invested, but we also invested because we saw it as an opportunity for Namibia, for Lüderitz, a city where there's very little opportunities. And because it is contributing to knowledge, it's like if we can get the seaweed stuff to work, then it will be a solution for a lot of other parts of the world as well. Not just for our credits, but really because it is a way to contribute to a broader sustainable development agenda. And I think that is a key piece of the puzzle, at least where we are trying to do our part.
Yeah, just to just mention again, for those that haven't seen it, we had a very interesting discussion about what De Beers, Kirsten and I, that has been posted to Dig In for Climate Change about, well, we covered a variety of issues, but including what De Beers is doing to abate emissions, to part of that reduce, replace, remove, the replace part of it. Actually, I guess the remove part of it, and that included, this really interesting investment in giant kelp forests off the coast of Namibia. For those viewers that are interested in seeing that, Veronica, to close up, how does the ICMM view this complex question, and obviously the nuances of judging different companies as well, with different complex cases at their various mine sites?
Yeah, so I think when we were working on our net zero commitment, we really understood that companies needed flexibility, and I think this is kind of a core part of our commitment, that there isn't a unique pathway to get to net zero, right? Especially if you're getting closer to site level, etc. How you get to net zero is influenced by a lot of different things. So, for example, your life of mine, whether you have, enough years to implement really disruptive technologies, or you need to think about more retrofitting. The jurisdiction you're operating, not only because of, the opportunities, because of renewable access, etc., but also the policy and regulation, the commodity, commodities have very, very different profile emissions, especially when scope 3 are, brought into the picture. So for precious metal producers, the focus could be upstream. And maybe your first thought would be, okay, let's work on greener and smarter procurement practices. But then, what Aimee and others were mentioning about the balancing. So for example, mining does a lot of local procurement. And if you put very, very difficult or very high standard on, green procurement, you might leave out, those local, suppliers. So how you balance, local development with greener suppliers, etc. For bulk metals, for example, the focus really is on downstream. So how do you engage, etc. Whether your operation is underground, surface, etc. So there are multiple factors that will shape the way you achieve net zero. But as ICMM, what we're really trying to look for is for those early adopters. So where these factors, come together, and you can see that there are some mines that they can accelerate their pathway, maybe they can achieve sooner. So if once you have those early adopters, share the knowledge back in the industry as fast as possible. So you create a critical mass of fast followers, and then you can create a critical mass that can drive at scale. So for us, that's really what we're trying to do. Identify where are those conditions, from these factors that I've mentioned. Let's try to, and let's, create those early adopters, and then, create that, snowball effect within the industry. But also, I just wanted to add that this is considering that, you keep mining the way has been done, as for the past 100 years. And also we have, for example, another project that is really looking and really thinking about how you can mine differently, how you can become more efficient and more precise in the way you operate. So the focus there is to reduce, of course, the tailings, the waste production, because of course that is one of the major constraints. But once you get your process more efficient on that, of course you start reducing energy, reducing emissions, etc. So again, I think all the panelists have mentioned that we really need to avoid seeing these as silos, and everything is quite interconnected. So that's kind of the focus for us as ICMM in this new strategy cycle that we're into.
That's a nice point to end on. So Veronica, Kirsten, Andrew, and Aimee, thank you for a really enjoyable discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Nadav.